The wind cut across the desert landscape like 1,000 invisible knives, each gust carrying with it the kind of cold that made a person question whether survival was even worth the effort. Morningstar had stopped counting the hours ago. Her feet, wrapped in thin strips of leather and cloth, had gone numb sometime after midnight, and now she simply moved forward because stopping meant death, and she was not ready for death yet. She was 32 years old, though the weather and the hardship of her life made her look nearly 50. Her dark eyes, once bright with the vitality of a woman in her prime, now held the glassy emptiness of someone who had endured too much loss. Her long black hair, matted with dust and sweat, hung in thick braids down her back, partially covered by a faded blanket she had wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl. Her dress was the traditional Apache style, handmade by her mother years ago when the world was different, when her family was alive, when the future seemed to stretch out before her like an open road instead of a narrow canyon with walls closing in from all sides. The reservation where Morningstar had lived for the last 8 years was 20 miles behind her now, though it felt like 100. She had made the decision to leave in the middle of the night, taking only what she could carry and moving in silence like she had learned as a girl. This was not her first escape. Years earlier, during the time when soldiers came to round up the Apache people, she had hidden in the mountains for weeks, surviving on roots and rainwater and the ancient knowledge her grandmother had given her. But that was when she was younger, when her body could withstand such hardship, when her will to fight was fierce and unbreakable. The reservation had become a prison of a different kind. The government agents were kind enough on the surface, providing food rations that were often spoiled or insufficient. The children attended a school where they were punished for speaking their own language, for honoring the traditions that had kept their people alive for centuries. Morningstar's 2 grandchildren, the children of her deceased daughter, were being raised in that school, being slowly transformed into something that was neither Apache nor American, caught between 2 worlds and fully belonging to neither. That morning, 3 days ago, she had learned that her grandchildren were being transferred to a school 200 miles away. She would never see them grow into adults. She would never teach her granddaughter the songs of her ancestors or show her grandson how to read the signs of nature that told where water could be found or which plants were safe to eat. That knowledge, that thread connecting her to her people stretching back through time, would be severed forever. So she had taken the only action she felt was left to her. She had put on her traveling clothes, the ones her mother had made decades ago, and she had walked away from the reservation into the desert night. She did not know exactly where she was going. That hardly seemed to matter anymore. The first 2 days of travel had been manageable. The autumn weather had been cool but not brutal, and she had moved steadily through the familiar desert terrain. She knew how to find water in the most unlikely places, how to shelter beneath rock overhangs, how to read the land like other people read books. The desert had been her home once, before the reservations, before the world had changed so completely. But, yesterday afternoon, the clouds had rolled in from the north, and the temperature had dropped with shocking speed. By evening, the first snow had begun to fall, something almost unheard of in this part of the desert during autumn. Morningstar had found shelter in a canyon and waited out the worst of it, but by morning it was clear that this was no ordinary storm. The wind had intensified, the snow continued to fall, and the temperature kept dropping further and further below what was survivable for someone with inadequate clothing and no supplies. She had tried to push through it anyway, reasoning that movement generated heat, that she needed to keep walking toward the mountains where she knew of caves and places where Apache people had hidden in the past. But the logic of her mind and the reality of her body were increasingly at odds. Her vision was becoming unclear, her thoughts were growing muddled, and her legs felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. The cabin appeared through the falling snow like a ghost, so sudden and unexpected that Morningstar wondered for a moment if she had finally hallucinated something into existence. But no, it was real. There was actual smoke coming from the chimney, actual evidence that human beings occupied this place. She stopped walking and stared at it, her rational mind battling against her instinct for survival. She was Apache. The government had spent decades making sure she understood that her people were the enemies of civilization, that they were dangerous savages who should be feared. And whoever was in that cabin was almost certainly not Apache. Almost certainly, they were one of the settlers, one of the people who had taken the land, who had pushed her people onto reservations and sent soldiers to hunt them down when they tried to escape. The smart thing to do, the thing her grandmother might have advised, would be to keep walking, to find a cave or a canyon, to survive through the night using the old ways, using the knowledge that had kept her people alive for thousands of years. But her grandmother had been dead for 40 years, and the world had changed. The old ways sometimes were not enough anymore when you were 32 years old and half-frozen and completely alone. Morningstar made a decision that she would spend the rest of her life wondering about, a decision that would transform everything. She began walking toward the cabin. Her legs moved slowly, each step deliberate and difficult. The snow was deep now, reaching up past her ankles, and her frozen feet were nearly useless. When she reached the cabin door, she had to use all her remaining strength to knock on it. 3 soft taps, barely audible over the wind. She waited, shaking violently, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Nothing happened. She knocked again, harder this time, not sure if she even had the physical strength to knock a third time. She heard movement inside, heard a voice saying something she could not quite make out. The door opened, bringing with it a rush of warm air that felt like a physical force against her frozen skin. The man in the doorway was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his entire life under the sun. He was holding a rifle, and, when he saw her standing there, dripping snow and shaking uncontrollably, his expression shifted from surprise to confusion to something that might have been pity. "Please," Morningstar said in English, the language she had been forced to learn at the boarding school, the language that felt wrong in her mouth but was sometimes the only way to communicate with people like him. "Please. I am cold. I need shelter." The man stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and hungry. Snow swirled around them in hypnotic patterns. Somewhere inside the cabin, a fire crackled in a stove, promising warmth and safety. "My name is Morningstar," she said, deciding that if this was going to be her last conversation before freezing to death, she might as well be honest about who she was. "I am Apache. I am alone. I have nowhere else to go." The man did not move. He did not smile or welcome her inside. He simply stood there, holding the rifle, looking at this frozen woman on his doorstep like she was a complicated mathematical problem that needed solving. "You're a long way from the reservation," he finally said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel. He did not have an accent that Morningstar could identify. He could have been from anywhere. "Yes," she said. She did not offer more explanation. What was the point? Whatever this man decided would be based on his own prejudices and his own judgments, not on any story she could tell. The man looked over her shoulder at the raging storm, as if considering whether it might be a more merciful option than whatever harm he might imagine she could do to him. Then, he stepped backward, opening the door wider. "Come inside before you fall down in the snow," he said. "I'm not interested in your death on my conscience." Morningstar stepped through the doorway into the cabin, and the door closed behind her with a finality that felt like crossing an invisible boundary into a new world. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around her like an embrace, and, for the first time in 3 days, she felt like she might actually survive what had started as her final journey into the desert. She had no way of knowing that this moment would change both of their lives forever, or that the decision this man made in that single instant would ripple outward through time in ways he could never have predicted. All she knew was that she was warm now, and alive, and somewhere inside the cabin, away from the worst of the storm, there was a chance, however small, that tomorrow might come. Thomas Brennan had not had another human being in his cabin for more than 2 years. The isolation had not been accidental. It was the result of a deliberate choice he had made after the events of 1885 that had shattered his life into pieces that he was still, even now, trying to glue back together. He watched Morningstar carefully as she stood near the fire, still shaking from the cold. She was trying to hide how badly she was trembling, but he could see it in her hands, in the way she held her shoulders rigid, in the slight chattering of her teeth when she thought he was not looking. He had seen men with severe frostbite before, had watched them slowly lose fingers and toes to the cold, and he knew that if he did not act soon, this woman would suffer permanent damage. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said, his voice sounding harsh even to his own ears. He had spent so long not talking to anyone that his voice came out rough and blunt, like he was communicating with a horse rather than a person. Morningstar looked at him with something that might have been alarm. He realized how his words could be interpreted, how in her desperate situation she might be afraid of what his intentions were. He turned away from her, respecting her fear even as it pained him to be suspected of something so base. "There is a room through that door," he said, pointing to the back of the cabin. "You will find clothing that might fit you. The previous owner of this cabin was a woman about your size. Her things have been in a chest for 2 years now. I see no reason they should not be used." He did not mention that the previous owner was his wife, that her clothing still carried faint traces of the lavender soap she had loved, that he had not been able to bring himself to give the clothes away even though every time he smelled that scent it felt like she was dying all over again. Some things were private. Some things a man did not say out loud. Morningstar moved toward the room he had indicated, her wet feet leaving small puddles on his wooden floor. He did not care about the floor. He cared about keeping her alive, though he could not fully articulate why this had become so important to him in the space of a single moment. While she was changing, Thomas moved around the cabin preparing what they would need. He heated water on the stove, added some of the medicinal herbs that had belonged to his wife, and set out the largest tin basin he had. When Morningstar emerged from the back room, she was wearing one of his wife's dresses, a simple blue calico that had been made for a woman of smaller stature but that would serve the purpose of covering her body and providing warmth. She looked different in the dress, more vulnerable somehow, though he recognized that this was probably his imagination. She looked at the basin of steaming water with obvious relief and understanding. "Your feet," he said, gesturing to the water. "Soak them, but not too hot or you will cause more damage. The skin will hurt as it warms. This is normal. Do not panic." Morningstar sat down on a wooden chair near the stove and, carefully, slowly, lowered her feet into the warm water. He saw her catch her breath, saw tears appear in her eyes as the frozen skin began to thaw. She was silent about the pain, did not cry out or complain, simply endured it with the kind of stoic acceptance that told him this was not the first time she had suffered and survived. Thomas made something simple for their dinner, beans that he had been cooking slowly for most of the day, cornbread, and strong black coffee. He had not prepared food for another person in years, and he found that the act of doing so brought back more memories than he wanted to face. His wife had loved cooking. She had made everything taste better somehow, had hummed while she worked, had believed that feeding people was an act of love. He set the food on the table without comment, and Morningstar came to eat, her feet wrapped now in clean cloth, her dark eyes reflecting the light of the fire. They ate in silence, and Thomas found that he did not mind the quiet. He had grown comfortable with quiet, had learned to like the sound of the wind and the fire and the occasional creaking of the cabin more than the sound of human voices. After the meal, as darkness completely enveloped the cabin and the storm continued to rage outside, Thomas found himself doing something he had not done in years. He began to talk. "My name is Thomas Brennan," he said. "I have a ranch about 5 miles from here, but I do not go there much anymore. There are people there who work for me, but I prefer to be alone. This cabin belonged to my wife's parents. They are both dead. She is dead too." Morningstar listened without commenting, simply watching him with dark eyes that seemed to see far more than he wanted to be seen. "My wife was killed in 1885, he continued, the words coming out like they had been stored up inside him for all these years, pressurized and desperate to escape. By Apache raiders. We were on our way to a social gathering in the town. There were 6 of us traveling together, and the raiders came out of nowhere. They killed the driver of the coach, killed a man who was with us, and they killed my wife. I was shot too, but I survived. The others survived. But my wife was dead by the time anyone could help her." He paused, and Morningstar remained perfectly still, as if any movement might scare away this fragile sharing of grief. The newspapers called it a tragedy. The government promised action against the Apache people. There was talk of forced relocation, of harsher punishments for tribes that harbored warriors who engaged in violence. "I was consumed with hatred," Thomas said, and his voice became even quieter, more introspective. "I wanted revenge. I wanted every Apache person to suffer the way I was suffering. I went to the militia meetings. I supported the harsh policies. I told people that all Apache were violent and dangerous and that they did not deserve any sympathy or kindness. He looked at Morningstar directly then, and she did not look away. And then, something happened that changed me. I will not tell you what it was, because that is not my story to share, but I was forced to see that my hatred was not justice. It was poison. It was destroying me far more effectively than any physical wound ever could. So I came to this cabin to live alone and to try to understand how to be human again, how to exist in a world where I was not consumed by anger and grief. Morningstar finally spoke. "The man who killed your wife, do you know if he still lives?" "No," Thomas said. "I do not know if he was among those killed by soldiers, or if he escaped, or if he died of other causes. I have made peace with the fact that I will never know. And I have realized that it would not matter to my wife, wherever she is now. She was a kind woman who believed in forgiveness. If I lived in her memory, I would live in kindness." The fire crackled, and outside the storm seemed to have reached a fever pitch, the wind howling like something wild and impossible. Inside the cabin, in the warm light of the fire, two broken people sat in the deep understanding that sometimes comes when loss is shared, when grief is recognized in another's eyes. "I have lost people too," Morningstar said quietly. "My daughter died from sickness 7 years ago. My husband was killed by soldiers 14 years ago. My grandchildren are being taken from me by the government, sent away to a school where they will forget who they are. I ran away because I could not bear to lose them as well, though I know that my running does not save them. It only saves me from having to watch the forgetting happen slowly." Thomas looked at this Apache woman who had sought shelter in his cabin, who carried her own devastating losses, and he felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than the numbing weight of grief and anger. He felt the possibility of connection, the awareness that this world was full of people suffering, and that sometimes the only salvation was to witness that suffering and to refuse to look away. "You should rest now," he said finally. "You can sleep in the back room. I will stay by the fire." Morningstar did not argue. She stood, still moving carefully on her injured feet, and made her way to the back room. Thomas heard her lie down, heard the rustle of blankets, heard the sounds of someone finally allowing their body to rest after days of terrible exertion. He sat by the fire through the long night, adding wood occasionally, listening to the storm rage outside. He thought about his wife, about the raiders who had killed her, about the cycles of violence and revenge that seemed to swallow people whole. And he thought about the way that sometimes, unexpectedly, life offered opportunities for redemption, for being different than we had been, for breaking the patterns that had been established by our pain. By the time the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, Thomas Brennan knew that his isolation was over. He did not yet know how to help this woman, what the future would hold for either of them, but he knew that he could not send her back out into the desert. He had spent years running from his humanity, and now, finally, he was ready to run back toward it. The storm lasted for 4 more days. The world outside the cabin became a place of white silence, where visibility extended no more than a few yards, where the wind screamed with such intensity that it seemed to shake the foundation of the small house. Inside, Morningstar and Thomas existed in a space that was neither fully isolated nor quite connected, learning each other's rhythms and needs without many words. Morningstar's feet were badly frostbitten but not destroyed. By the 3rd day, the worst of the pain had subsided into a dull ache, manageable enough that she could walk short distances around the cabin. Thomas showed her where things were stored, how to operate the stove, what food supplies were available. She began to cook again, preparing meals that brought new tastes and techniques to the simple food that Thomas had been eating for so long. The meals became a kind of ritual, a way of showing respect and care that transcended the awkwardness of their situation. Morningstar made a soup from dried chilies and corn that Thomas's wife's recipes would never have included, and she saw something like wonder in his eyes as he tasted it. He told her that he could taste her culture in the food, could taste the generations of knowledge passed down through families, and that it felt like he was being allowed entry into something sacred. In the evenings, as the fire burned low, they talked. Thomas asked her questions about her life, about Apache traditions, about the way her people had survived for centuries in this harsh landscape before the world had changed. Morningstar asked him about his ranch, about how he had come to this place, about whether he believed that the future held any possibility for people like them. "I do not know," he would say in response to that last question. "But I know that the future is not yet written. I know that what we do today creates tomorrow. And I know that I am no longer the man I was before you came to this cabin." On the fifth morning, the storm finally broke. The snow stopped falling, the wind died down, and the sun appeared over the mountains with a clarity that seemed almost impossible after so many days of gray. Thomas stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked out at the transformed landscape, and Morningstar came to stand beside him. "You will leave now," Thomas said. It was not a question, though it was phrased like one. "You have a plan. You were moving towards something when you came to my door." Morningstar did not immediately answer. The truth was more complicated than he seemed to assume. She had been moving away from something, not toward it. But, standing here now, looking out at the snowy desert, she realized that the absence of a destination had always been a kind of destination in itself. "I was going to try to reach my sister," she said finally. "She lives on the Mescalero Apache Reservation, nearly 200 miles from here. I have not seen her in 16 years. I thought that I might be able to stay with her, that if I was no longer on the government rolls, if I disappeared, then, perhaps my grandchildren would eventually be released to me because the government would lose track of them." "That is a very dangerous plan," Thomas said. 200 miles on foot, in winter, with no supplies, on land that is filled with soldiers and vigilantes who would be delighted to capture an Apache woman traveling alone. "Yes," Morningstar acknowledged. "But it is the only plan I have." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and careful. "I have another idea. I do not know if you will like it, but I wish to offer it for your consideration." He told her about his ranch, about the workers there, about the fact that the ranch house had a large kitchen and many rooms. He told her that he had substantial resources, that he had never used the money he had been saving for things that did not matter. He told her that if she was willing, she could come to the ranch house with him, could learn to manage the kitchen and the household, could be given a position of dignity and respect that the world would recognize. "More than that," he continued, "I have connections. I have money. I can hire lawyers. I can petition the government on your behalf. I can argue that your grandchildren should be released to a responsible adult who can provide for them. It will take time, but it is not impossible. Many of the policies are beginning to change. There are people in the government now who believe that forcing children away from their families is not the right path forward." Morningstar felt something inside her chest crack open, hope, perhaps, or the possibility of hope. She had allowed herself to stop believing in such things so long ago that she had almost forgotten what the feeling was like. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You do not know me. I am Apache. The people I was born to killed your wife." "Because I am not my grief anymore," Thomas said simply. "And because if we spend our lives being defined by loss, then the people we have loved have been lost twice, once to death and once to the bitterness that we allow their deaths to create in us. I want to be defined by something other than loss. And I believe that you do as well." They left the cabin the next day, walking back toward the ranch house as the snow began to melt around them. Thomas had given Morningstar a horse to ride, had provided her with proper clothing and supplies, had treated her with the courtesy and respect that one gives to an honored guest. The ranch workers stared when Thomas arrived with an Apache woman, and they whispered amongst themselves, but Thomas made it clear through his words and his actions that Morningstar was to be treated as someone of value and authority. He gave her control of the kitchen and the household management, and she began to transform the place with her presence and her skills. But the most important work began with the letters. Thomas hired a lawyer in the nearest town, a man named Samuel Mitchell, who was young and idealistic and believed that many of the government policies toward Native Americans were fundamentally unjust. Samuel wrote letters to the Indian Affairs Office in Arizona Territory. He argued that Morningstar had been providing food and shelter to support her grandchildren's education, that she was a woman of stable character and resources, that the children would benefit from having family connection while they continued their schooling. The process took 14 months. There were setbacks and disappointments. There were letters that were ignored, and forms that had to be filled out repeatedly, and officials who seemed determined to make the process as difficult as possible. But Thomas and Samuel persisted, and Morningstar waited and worked and tried to maintain hope even when it seemed foolish to do so. Finally, in the spring of 1889, nearly a year and a half after Morningstar had stumbled through the snow to Thomas's cabin, a telegram arrived. The government had agreed to release her grandchildren into her custody, with the stipulation that she maintain records of their activities and prove that they were receiving adequate education and care. The children were to be sent to the ranch within the month. Morningstar cried when Thomas read her the telegram, cried with a kind of joy and relief so profound that it left her weak. She had not believed that such an outcome was possible, and yet here it was, materialized from nothing by the persistence of two people who refused to accept that injustice was permanent. When the children arrived, on a hot day in late spring, Morningstar barely recognized them. Her grandson was 13 now, tall and strong, already developing into a man. Her granddaughter was 11, and she looked like she had forgotten how to smile. But when they saw their grandmother, something changed in their faces. They began to remember, not just the woman she was now, but the world they came from, the identity that had been partially stolen from them. Morningstar kept them in school. Thomas insisted on this, and she agreed that education was important. But she also taught them about their culture, about the songs and stories and ways of their people. She taught them to honor both worlds, to understand that they could be educated and Apache at the same time, that these identities did not have to be in conflict. Thomas watched this transformation with a sense of peace that he had not known was possible. He saw Morningstar become whole again in a way that had nothing to do with her physical healing and everything to do with the restoration of family, of purpose, of connection to something larger than herself. And he found that watching her heal was healing for him as well. He never remarried. Instead, he allowed Morningstar to help him run the ranch, to manage the household, to contribute her skills and her knowledge to the operation of the property. They were not a couple in the traditional sense, but they were partners, bound together by shared loss and shared survival and the mutual recognition that life had offered them both a second chance. By the 1890s, the Brennan Ranch had become something unusual for the time, a place where Apache workers were treated with respect and paid fair wages, where the household was managed by an Apache woman of significant authority, where the mixing of cultures was not seen as a corruption but as a source of strength. People from the towns nearby whispered about it, but they also came to recognize that the ranch was prosperous and well-managed, that Thomas Brennan had not destroyed himself by extending kindness across the cultural divide. In the last years of her life, when Morningstar was in her 60s and Thomas was in his 70s, they would sometimes sit together on the porch of the ranch house, looking out at the land they had lived on for more than 2 decades. Her grandchildren had grown into adults, had found their own paths in a world that was slowly, incrementally, beginning to recognize the injustice of the policies that had been inflicted on Native American peoples. Thomas never spoke much about his dead wife after that period, but sometimes, on certain evenings, Morningstar would see a sadness cross his face and she would understand that he was thinking of her, remembering her, holding her in his heart without bitterness or rage. "Do you regret opening the door that night?" Morningstar asked him once, near the end of his life. Thomas took a long time to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "No," he said. "That was the first moment I chose who I wanted to be instead of being defined by who loss had made me. Every day since that moment, I have been grateful for the chance to make that choice." Morningstar died in 1912, from a respiratory illness that seemed to come upon her suddenly. Thomas died just 3 months later, and the doctor said it was simply old age, but the ranch workers who had known them both believed that his heart simply stopped beating after hers did, that he had found his way back to his wife at last. Their story would eventually become known among the Apache people, a story of unlikely survival and grace, of how hatred could be transformed into compassion, of how the cruelest winters sometimes brought people together in ways that the gentlest summers never could. And it would endure as a testament to the possibility of change, to the human capacity for growth, and to the redemptive power of choosing kindness even, or perhaps especially, when that choice cost everything and promised nothing in return.